Good evening. My name is Alexander Jones, and I am the bossless of the Epsilon Iota chapter of Omega Psi-Phi Fraternity Incorporated. We thank you for attending our Omega Uplift Series number 12, a conversation on Black theology from the Christian perspective. Omega men are always hard at work as we continue to answer the many calls from around the community. The Social Action Committee felt the need to have a further conversation to speak about the importance and give true understanding of this matter. I want to thank our Social Action Committee again for putting together this program to keep our community informed. Since the Omega Psi-Phi Fraternity Incorporated was founded on the campus of Howard University 110 years ago, we've been guided by our four cardinal principles of manhood, scholarship, perseverance, and uplift. Omega has played and continues to play a vital role in the social and economic growth of our country and enhancing the lives of African Americans. As a fraternity, we operate under 10 nationally mandated programs, which are centralized around issues in our communities. Epsilon Iota chapter has been a staple by providing service to the greater New Haven community for over 30 years. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few reminders. All participants will be muted during the presentation, but we do encourage your active participation by utilizing the chat feature. All questions will be acknowledged at the appropriate time. I would like to take the time and thank our esteemed panelists for agreeing to participate and give their expertise on this very important topic. Our series moderator is, again, a brother who plays many key roles in Omega, not only on the chapter level, but also district and international levels. He is also no stranger to the greater New Haven community, where he serves as the head coach of the Wilbur Cross boys varsity basketball team. He is also a co-founder of Storytellers New Haven. He serves as a mentor to the youth, a leader amongst many men, and as an advocate for all. We hope you enjoy our program. I will now turn it over to our Social Action Chairman and our Omega Uplift Series moderator, Brother Kevin Walton.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Brother Bossless, for that very nice introduction. And the check, as usual, the check is in the mail, brother. So I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight, for another exciting program. As we state to you, we've been doing the Uplift series for 2 years now. It started as a necessity during the pandemic while we were home, and we did many topics ranging from COVID, and now we're into a whole new realm. So I'm excited to learn tonight. Again, our Social Action Committee has been hard at work to continue to provide these programs for the community. So we thank you all for your continued support. And with that, we'll get right into it. So tonight we have with us 3 individuals who are going to bring the fire and teach us and help us learn about different things within Black religion. And the format is going to be, we're going to give each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves. And they're also going to give us a presentation. And then we'll have an opportunity to have questions and answers. We ask that you put your questions in the chat, and we will have one of the Social Action Committee members will monitor the chat and read your questions. And we'd like to have a nice back and forth. So with that, you didn't come here to hear me. So I will give a brief introduction to our first panelist, Minister Quadre Harris. You have the floor, brother.
Quadre, it's on you.
Apologies for that. My internet connection was a little bit unstable. I think I'm reconnected now. Am I coming through clear? Wonderful. Okay. Let me just share my screen with you. Okay, so good evening, folks. It is a privilege and an honor to be sitting before you today. It's how do I want to address this? You can call me Minister Harris because I've been invited here by the wrong fraternity. You're not allowed to call me Q. But no, in all seriousness, we give honor and praise to the brothers of Omega Psi-Phi for sharing a platform with us, and really coming together to educate our communities on topics that are really important to us. Special thanks to the Reverend Samuel Rossley, a fellow panelist, a friend and a mentor, for personally extending the invite. So we thank you for your vision and your leadership. So I'm going to start us off by talking about Black theology, particularly from the perspective of how Black theology came to be an academic discipline in Western universities and Western academies. And I really want to focus on the life and legacy of what many of us that are familiar with Black theology would know to be as the father or the great systematizer of Black theology, that of course being the Reverend Dr. James Howell Cone. And we are coming up on the, forgive me if I'm mad, fourth year anniversary of his transition to being an ancestor in just a week or so ago. All right, so the bulk of my presentation is going to center around the life and legacy of James Cone, who came to us from Arkansas. And you can see in the year that he was born, 1938. Arkansas is a segregated part of the country. And this is important to note because it is going to shape his theological trajectory, both as a pastor and as a career academic, to his own coming into his understanding of himself being a Christian in a time where lynchings and violence are very much a part of his daily reality, right? And these were not topics that his church shied away from. He tells us in his most recent work, his memoirs, said I wasn't going to tell anyone, right? Especially, you know, like being a part of being ordained in the African Methodist legacy of being right at the combating what it means to encounter racism in this country, right? So this is his daily reality as a young boy growing up in Arkansas, right? And it contextualizes and shapes the questions that he's going to raise and ultimately the conclusions that he's going to make about God, right? He would eventually go on to do a PhD in theology at Garrett Evangelical Seminary in the Chicago area in 1965. And this is right at the heart of what we know to be the classic civil rights movement, right? So again, another historical context that's going to shape where he's going to come from and how he's going to contribute to Black theology becoming a discipline. Am I frozen? Am I back? I saw I was frozen.
You're good.
I'm good now?
Yes.
Someone help me out. What did I get cut off?
You're good. We didn't lose anything.
Oh, we didn't lose anything? All right, cool. We all set. Okay, so 1965, Dr. Cone is finishing up his PhD right at and many historians would say the climax of the civil rights movement, right? This is at the height of King's influence in the country as a civil rights leader. And we're going to get into the way King shapes Cone's legacy in just a slide or two, all right? And then in 1969, this is where most of the quotes that I'm going to pull from in this presentation is going to come from James Cone's first book, Black Theology and Black Power, which came out in 1969 and changed the entire trajectory of American theology, right? And this is really the text, honestly, that gets Cone in trouble a lot when a lot of his critics like to cherry pick some of the more, frankly, inflammatory theological statements that often gets associated with his legacy. Right, but what I want to raise for us today is if we are going to have a thorough understanding of what Black theology is, what the concerns are, and frankly, its relevance for Black people today, it's important to start at the very beginning. And there is something to be said about making room for, frankly, Black rage as a way to learn about God. So yeah, we're gonna start with Black theology and Black power. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, just want to clarify a few terms for our understanding, just to help us follow along on the same page. All right. So the first term we want to define there is theology, and this is a term that many of us often are familiar with. Some of us also are not, and simply just means God talk, right? Like how people talk about and what we say about God. And obviously, those of us that are familiar with Black church, familiar with Black religion, know that we engage this practice pretty much on a regular basis, right? In our prayer lives, right? In our preaching, in the way that we commune and greet with each other, right? We often engage in theology in this regard, right? In Cone's particular context, his theology, Blackness, right? Again, another one of those hot button topics that often gets him in trouble and cherry picked, right? So Blackness for him in his theology is going to be a symbol, or the best expression, he might put it in God of the Oppressed, of what it means to be oppressed, or what it means to suffer, what it means to exist in a way that's unideal for what it means to be human. And expressions of that are made on a daily basis in society through what it means to be Black. Okay, so we combine those two terms, and here's what we're here to talk about today: Black theology. So Cone is going to understand and define Black theology as a God talk of freedom coming out of the particularity of Black Americans, all right, or Africans in the United States of America, or Africans in this particular part of the diaspora, all right. And last and certainly but not least, we want to talk a little bit about Black power, right? And this is another one of those things that Cone trying to centralize Black power as a religious idea, as a theological concept, associating Black power, this, radical political statement, with God, right? Is going to be another part of his legacy that often makes Cone hard to accept and hard to even, centralize his theology in Black church spaces, all right? It's the idea that if Black Americans and white Americans are going to have what Scripture calls reconciliation, if we are going to forgive and be forgiven and lean into fellowship. I'm seeing my connection is unstable. Okay, I think I'm back now. If we are going to lean into fellowship, right, it's going to be the responsibility of Black people, the descendants of Africans, the descendants of the former enslaved, to lead the way that relationship transpires and lead the way that relationship develops concretely in society. He says oftentimes in Black theology and Black power, because of the way the history of our society has developed, frankly, we cannot trust white people's instincts when it comes to telling us how we should be interacting with each other in regards to race. Okay, and we'll get into that a little bit further as well. So the main question for Dr. Cone, writing Black theology and Black power, is how can he reconcile his identity as being a Christian growing up in the AME church in segregated Arkansas with this new spirit that's emerging from all over the country in the late 60s of the Black Power movement. And Cone had to ask himself some difficult questions, as all of us often have to do when we first encounter Black theology. So it would make sense him being the father of the discipline. He starts off by asking himself some difficult questions. And the first one was dealing with the reality of how he interacted with Christianity through the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think he says in several occasions throughout his canon and his corpus that in many ways, like, he idolized King. I think as many of us do growing up in Black church spaces, right, where it's so often thought to be unapproachable or beyond critique, right? And it's this model of nonviolence for Cole, right, that he thinks he has to be uncompromising on with a lot of the questions that he's raising and a lot of the ways that he's talking about God and a lot of the ways that he's thinking about God, right? He thinks like nonviolence is this, how would you say, a uncompromising fundamental to his Christian identity, right? And for these reasons, for holding on to these central ideas with regard to his faith, it often led him to, by his own admission, be dismissive of Malcolm X and even demonize him to a certain level, right? And again, I think this is a very important question that we have to ask ourselves if we are going to engage Black theology. It's like, to what degree is our Christian identity reliant on demonizing other religious identities, right? Or demonizing those that don't particularly have a religious identity, right? Or like one that doesn't easily fall in line with our Christian understanding of ethics and morals and how the world should be, right? These are things that he had to wrestle with, right? And he admits that he often tried not to pay attention to Malcolm X's harsh critiques of what white America was doing to Black life on a regular basis, right? He often tried to, dismiss Malcolm as an ineffective leader, right? And it became really hard for him to continue to do that after both these leaders were assassinated for him, right? And it's, this is, King being assassinated as, in light of so much Black death and in light of so many lynchings and churches being firebombed, he's still finding a way to preach this nonviolent Christian message, right? And he still ultimately gets consumed by the same American violence that he fought so hard to combat, right? So Cone had to rethink himself and his Christian identity, right? And that's a very important, almost, how would you say, it's almost a revelatory experience for him, or frankly a conversion experience that he goes through after the assassinations of both Martin and Malcolm. And this is where he found himself trying to mediate between. Connection is unstable again. Better. Am I good? Okay. So he finds himself like trying to merge these two great civil rights leaders' legacies in a way that's effective to get him to deal with these questions, okay? And then Black theology and Black power is born. Now, the major problem that Cone has is, as a theologian in the academy, as a theologian that's primarily doing his work in universities, his audience are other academics. And most of these academics to do is, frankly, use white theology as a way to give his Black theology a sound found. They countered problems along the way, and just mapped out a few of them here that I'll elaborate on real briefly because I know I'm coming up on my time. All right, so like what Cone encountered when he was doing his PhD is that American theology, in many ways, idolized European Christianity and European culture in a similar way that Cone found himself idolizing King, right? It was how the American Academy learned to talk about God from thousands of years of European academies, frankly, made them look to white people as this is the ultimate model of God. This is what God in the flesh looks like. And that type of thinking, that type of theological speech, that type of praying, that type of preaching formed what it meant to be a Christian over a really long history and time. And in part of that, the way he describes it, and other Black intellectuals during his time will describe as well, is this problem of the non-human. Often said explicitly in Western academies and often alluded to, is that there's just this underlying assumption in the thought trajectory that people of African descent are somehow less human than Europeans, if human at all. And it like comes out in various different ways, right? This assumption that I think the most relevant one when we're talking about Black theology from a Christian perspective is the idea that African culture lacked awareness of God or lacked awareness of divinity prior to intervention of Christianity, particularly from Europeans, right? And that underlying theological framing or underlying theological assumption often led many of Cone's white contemporaries to either downplay or ignore the fact that Black people were suffering in America during their time. So they're not writing about the civil rights movement, which was the most explosive in the 60s, right? They're ignoring people like Malcolm X and King and Medgar Evers and completely ignoring them and talking about God in ways that is just completely detached from these Black people's realities, right? And in his critique of things, he displays that he mastered the American canon. He displayed that he mastered the European canon, and he comes to some very jarring conclusions with regard to his Christian identity and his Christian message, right? And it's, again, he started off trying to reconcile Christianity and Black power, and ultimately comes to the conclusion that Black power is Christ's central message to 20th century America, right? Some of the, again, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, some of the hot button quotes that often get cherry picked from his legacy are some of these theological claims that we have mapped out here that, if and when given its proper context, still makes sense for what the best of Black theology is, right? This connection unstable. Hold on. Okay, I think we're back. So this basic understanding and idea that God is Black, and again, building off of Western American European theologians to make this radical claim was theological brilliance. Basing it on the idea that, yes, God is one with the oppressed and Blackness is what it best means to be oppressed in the context of America. Logically, how could God not be Black, right? And by way of that, and finding Blackness particularly in the flesh, right? Understanding that any form of racism, particularly this anti-Black racism that we are dealing with and living with in America on a daily basis, this denies the incarnation. This denies that God became flesh, particularly in the Son of Jesus Christ. So it's the ultimate form of racism, is the ultimate form of idolatry. And part of that conclusion is white churches and white theology that embrace these racist doctrines are in fact the Antichrist. And I know I'm coming up on my time. I think one, again, often cherry picked. And I think one of the jarring examples was, Jeremiah Wright building on similar theological concepts. You know, when they try to toss him aside for preaching that sermon that aged really well, actually, goddamn America. This idea that if God is white, particularly within white churches and white theological academies, it is our responsibility, according to Black theology, to kill that God. All right, my connection was, I'm back. All right, so I think I can stop here and take questions.
Okay, so thank you, Minister Harris, for that presentation. And I can turn it over to Brother Ruel Dixon, who will take some questions from the chat.
All right. I have a question here. Would you say that Malcolm and Martin's difference in philosophy was based in their different religious beliefs and identities?
So I think Dr. Cone would say you can't dismiss that, right? It's, yes, obviously Malcolm was a Sunni Muslim, particularly towards the end of his life, and King is absolutely a Baptist pastor in every meaning of the word, right? Like, he's the archetype for a lot of times what we consider the Black male preacher, especially in the Baptist church, right? So we can't talk about their identities and their legacies seriously, and without accounting for, which I think in many ways is the most important aspect of their lives, right? I think Cone makes that point brilliantly in his book, Martin and Malcolm in America. And at the same time, I don't know if Cone would use this definitive of language, but there is a certain element to both of them where their identity as African descendant men or as Black men was, if not just as important as their religious identity, it was definitely in the conversation as being like, you know, one of their like true core values, right? And in that, I think the way they understood themselves as men, particularly as Black men, led to their, frankly, polar opposite stances when it came to like what we would call nonviolence versus counter violence, or, you know, however we want to frame that language, right? So yeah, I think it's a religious identity thing, but it's also a Black identity thing with how they saw themselves in relation to the overall struggle on a global level as well. And, you know, it's I think it's a testament of two brilliant men that could see the same evidence and come to different conclusions about how Black people should move forward religiously, right? I hope that answered your question.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So yeah, we'll continue to put questions in the chat, and we'll get back to them when we can. But right now, we're gonna move on to our, and thank you, Minister Harris. And now we're gonna move on to our second panelist, and that's our brother, Reverend Ross Lee.
Thank you, Brother Walton. So I'm going to talk about Black theology and the Bible, and go from there. So Black theology, I don't have any screen stuff. So if I start going too fast, y'all just let me know. Black theology, as Minister Harris has said, is a theology of liberation. It is God talk from human beings about God. Its greatest benefit, in my humble opinion, is that it gives the Black church a foundation from which to understand the God in which we believe, disentangled from Western theology, written and spread mostly by white men, mainly for the purposes of supporting the dominant culture's view of the world, including politics, economics, and societal structures, i.e. power. Black theology, however, like most theology, has its limitations. The primary one is that it tends to be an exercise of the academy. It is taught, talked about, and studied in colleges and universities, mainly seminaries and divinity schools. While it is taught to many students who have church ministries as a professional goal, its discussion barely makes its way into church settings. This limitation is not mainly the fault of the topic, but of the preachers and the pastors who fail to engage their congregations on any topics of theology. Also because primarily, and in many cases, the exclusion of any books discussed in the church except the Bible. Black theology generally does not talk about the Bible, and a lot of theologies don't really talk about the Bible. They discuss other theological perspectives. They discuss concepts from the Bible, but they're not really biblically based for the most part. In the Christian church, Black and white, the Bible is the book by which all other books are examined, judged, and critiqued. So how does Black liberation theology serve a purpose among Black Christians if it does not engage the book which dominates the conversation among the church? This is essentially the question Dr. Vincent Wimbush, a Black New Testament scholar, raises in an article he wrote in 1989 and rewrote several times, which was written for an academic audience. Professor Wimbush is a graduate of, he has a PhD from Harvard University, the New Testament. He attended Yale Divinity School, where he received a Master of Divinity degree. And he graduated from a small school on the Red Clay Hills of Georgia for his bachelor's degree, better known as Morehouse College. Now, that is not the reason I'm using him, as I see smiles on somebody's faces. But he is, in fact, the only biblical scholar who engages this issue that I have been able to run into, especially engages it in depth. So that's why I use him in this. Wimbush's article is entitled "Historical Critical Criticism as Liberation: A Proposal for an African-American Biblical Hermeneutic." The title and how it fits into the discussion needs explanation. Historical cultural criticism is a particular method of studying the Bible used by most credible biblical scholars and by their authentic students. It involves examining of the history of the ancient world from which the biblical texts come in order to get as clear as possible an understanding of what the writers meant when they wrote what they wrote. This kind of study can include word study, which is going back and looking at the original words of certain biblical texts in their original language, the structure of the writing, which is called structuralism, and other types of examination. Historical criticism frees Bible verses from interpretations trapped and motivated by present-day assumptions and purposes. It allows us to better understand what the writer says when they said it, what the biblical writers meant when they said it, not what the contemporary church thinks and assumes about any particular Bible reading. This will become important later. The word hermeneutic in its title speaks to one's method of interpretation. If you remember your Greek mythology from high school that we studied, there's a god Hermes. Hermes was the messenger god. That's where the word hermeneutic come from. It's a method of interpretation. We all have a hermeneutical method by which we interpret the Bible, whether we know it or not, whether we understand where that method is leading us, or whether we have ever had the chance of examining that method to determine if it is the one we should be using or not using. The fact is, most of us inherited our method, most likely in the same way most of us inherited the church we attend. When Wimbush writes the title Historical Cultural Criticism as Liberation, a proposal for an African-American biblical hermeneutic, he is suggesting a historical cultural method of interpretation of the Bible for African Americans, like Black theology, points us toward liberation in our expressions and belief in God. Let me say that again. When he writes this title, he is suggesting a historical cultural method of interpretation of the Bible for African Americans, like Black theology, points us towards liberation in our expressions and belief in God. Now, why is that important? Here's what Wimbush writes. Not all solutions or agenda are good for everyone, nor are all good solutions good for everyone at the same time. Every people must respect and assess its own immediate social, political, and economic situation, its own problems and challenges, and apply the needed remedies in light of the assessed situations. To do less or otherwise can be self-defeating, perhaps even pathological and genocidal. What may have been a good strategy in Birmingham or Selma can be disastrous in Johannesburg. End quote. The principle of self-assessment and self-remedy of quote unquote know thyself and quote unquote heal thyself is no less relevant in the sphere of things religious. It can hardly be different, since religious matters are not apolitical, they're not without political consequences, they're not asocial, and they're not unaffected by history. So not even all liberation theologies or hermeneutical constructs are liberating for all people. Since different people have different histories and experiences and find themselves in different social, political, and religious situations, not all prescriptions for salvation should be respected by all people. Africans, that's the end of his quote, Africans stolen from their homeland and forced on American plantations were not at first familiar with book religion. They soon came to understand the power of the book, the Bible, what power that book had on the Europeans who brought them here and adopted it as a language. Africans adopted it as a language through which they could communicate, not only with the Europeans, but with one another as well, as often they were, jumbled and their languages were not the same. Wimbush writes, quote, since their initial engagement with the Bible, African Americans have always sought to articulate their self-understandings, their problems and challenges and aspirations through biblical rhetoric and imagery, end quote. They did not engage the Bible in the same manner as their white counterparts. When critical studies that their white counterparts. Now, let me say something about this for a minute. We hear a lot from various people who talk about how they say things like Christianity was beat into enslaved people. That is not true. It's actually a bit ridiculous. It's very hard to beat a belief into somebody. You can make somebody say something and you can make somebody act in a certain way, but a belief is something that's internal. And it's not something that can be beat into them. So when they engage the Bible, they were not engaging it in the same way that the Europeans who introduced them to it was engaging. Now, how do we know this? We know this because of what came out of the plantations. So they were mainly being taught things like slaves obey your masters, right? Serve your master as you do the Lord. And this kind of stuff. That's what they were being taught, and telling that, if you do this, you're going to be you can be a good slave and you'll go to heaven. And oftentimes they were taught when you go to heaven, you'll be able to serve your master when you get there. So that was not something they were imbibing. And the reason we know this is not because of any theological treaties or things like that, because they were obviously not writing. But we know it because of the songs that they sang. Okay, the language in the songs never repeated what they were being taught and what was being pressed upon them by the enslavers during that time. When critical studies of the Bible emerged in the 19th century, Africans had already developed a method, a hermeneutic, by which they engaged the Bible. It was not by the read, as Cone said, the reading and rereading of the text. It was by the telling and retelling of the stories. Wimbush explains Africans in America engagement with the Bible was different than that of the enslavers, as the Africans were neither taught nor allowed to read the letters, the quote unquote letters of the biblical text, therefore were not crucial to their appropriation of Christian tradition. What became important to them was the telling and retelling, the hearing and rehearing of biblical stories. Stories of difficult sojourn, of perseverance, of faith, of survival, of ultimate victory. The quote unquote letters of the biblical text were not crucial in their appropriation of Christian traditions. Identification with the heroes and heroines of the Bible, with the people of God, with the persecuted, suffering, but ultimately victorious Jesus, constituted faith for Africans on the plantation. Obviously, this engagement of the Bible as the single most important depository of Christian tradition was directly influenced and determined by African Americans' political, economic, and social experience. Let me explain that a little bit. We have kind of lost some of this today in our understanding of religion. But the fact of the matter is that religion is based in many places, on most places, quite frankly, on people's social condition, on their political reality, how they engage the world and how the world engages them. In that way, the religion serves the people as opposed to the people serving the religion. And that has been lost in a significant way, I think, within the African-American context. As Africans had not developed a way to interpret biblical texts in the face of the critical methods in the 19th century, they adopted those of the dominant culture. And this is where we began to lose that perspective that was created on the plantation by Africans, where we kind of jettisoned our perspective and started picking up the perspective of the Western theological expression and the hermeneutical expression of the Bible. As Wimbush explained, they assumed those perspectives to be innocent. Both communities, the formerly enslaved and the formerly enslavers, allowed the Euro-American theological constructs and politics to remain in place while they explained their existence on an altogether different basis. The white church operated in a very different social and cultural context than the Black church, because they were a part of the power structure. The white church was. The Black church was fighting against that power structure and fighting towards and for liberation. But they were using the same hermeneutical methods of interpretation for the Bible, which thwarted their efforts towards liberation, because those methods were not about liberating anybody. They felt they were already liberated, quite frankly. So herein lies the problem. While African Americans were seeking liberation from the structures and restrictions put in place by the dominant culture, they adopted the dominant culture's hermeneutics, its method of biblical interpretation, as their own. But, Wimbush explains, the uncritical embrace of alien confessional frameworks, including biblical interpretation, which has characterized African American religious experience in the past, now began to have the most horrible effects upon African Americans. No longer can they either innocently or uncritically embrace the confessional frameworks of other peoples without having to face enormous problems, social, political, and economic. Hence, as the late Professor James Cone has led us away from Western theological concepts towards a more liberating expression of our faith, Wimbush declares we must be led away from Western biblical interpretations to complete the journey towards liberation. I lost my spot here. Okay, where am I? Okay. So Wimbush writes, the Bible should be the focus of the challenge that Afro-Christian churches must begin to address in order to embrace and define Christian traditions anew for affirmation and for liberation. Without an increased measure of hermeneutical control over the Bible, it will prove impossible for Afro-Christian churches to articulate self-understanding, maintain integrity as separate communities, and determine their mission in the world. So biblical historical study as liberation, he says, equals self-defense. Historical study of the Bible is required on the part of the African-American churches for the sake of self-criticism and self-defense. The historically conscious community, as readers of the biblical text, would be made aware of their historically determined character. Historically conscious readings serve to make all interpreting communities from whatever social world, with whatever set of social experiences, more honest. There is nothing inherent in the notion of the Bible as Holy Scripture, which should preclude any people, including African Americans, from engaging the Bible as a collection of historically conditioned documents. Descriptive historical investigation is, in fact, all the more needed when the Bible is understood as Holy Scripture. So what he's talking about here is when we consider the Bible to be holy, when we consider it to be something that is leading us to God and engaging us with God, we have that much more reason to understand what the Bible is actually saying, as opposed to merely getting an interpretation from some other people who are not on the same trajectory that we need to be on as a Christian church, trying to lead our community towards a liberating perspective around our politics, our social reality, our economic reality. I don't know, how much time do I have? I wasn't watching the clock. This thing keeps going back up to the front. Okay. Religion is not something that we just do. It is also, and more importantly, a community shaping aspect of our lives and living. Perhaps one that is the most important in many, many circles. As the Bible is the most important aspect of how we understand our Christian faith as a tool, it has the most power over our personal decisions, our communal strategies, and our historic liberation. Such a tool should not simply be placed in the hands of others who do not have our best interest in mind. It is a tool we should control with an interpretive method that we're also able to defend. I'm going to stop right there.
Right. So, brother, and thank you, brother Ross Lee. And so as I was sitting here listening, I was thinking that we probably should have had a feature where we could have passed the plate or something, because we're getting our fill this evening, right? So I know, brother Dixon, do we have any questions in the chat?
We have two, but it's geared towards brother Quadri. So I don't know if you want to do them now or you want to wait until the end.
All right, let's do that, because our third and certainly not our least panelist, Reverend Gabby Wilkes, has been waiting for a while, so we'll bring her, give her time, and then we'll do all the questions at the end. Is that okay?
Yes, and if anyone have any other questions, just keep putting them in the chat.
Please do, because we have a great panel here. They have lots of knowledge, and they're willing to share with us. And so, any of those pressing questions you've had, please put them in the chat. So, Reverend Wilkes, we'll turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Tonight has already been so rich. And so I hope that everyone is catching this knowledge that is going forth. And I look forward to just adding one more piece to the puzzle. Before I get going, I definitely want to thank the men of Epsilon Iota chapter of Omega Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Reverend Ross Lee, for the direct invitation. And thank you, Quadri, my classmate turned family member, who spoke my name to Reverend Ross Lee and thought that I would be a good fit. So I've been asked to talk about Black women and Black theology. And out of the discipline of Black women and Black theology comes conversations around both feminism and womanism. And so I hope that one or both of those terms, feminists or womanists, are somewhere in your headspace of familiarity. But even if they are not, I hope that you will pay close attention to some things that I would like to share that really emanate out of the presentations that both Quadri and Samuel have already given. Just for a double check, if you're able to see my slides, would you just give me a thumbs up or let me know if you can see it? Excellent. All right, let's get going. I want to start my presentation off with a quote from Nina Simone. Nina Simone was at her prime in the 1960s and beyond. So while she does not necessarily use the language of feminist or womanist, I love this quote that she gives in a late 2000, I believe the interview was in 2005 or 6 with the BBC later in her life. And an interviewer asks her, "Do you sing from a place of anger?" And she responds by saying, "No, I sing from intelligence. I sing from letting them know that I know who they are and what they have done to my people around the world. That's not anger. Anger has its place. Anger has fire, and fire moves things. But I sing from intelligence. I don't know who they are." And if you ever heard an interview by Nina Simone, you know that when she says the word darling, she said, lets the R kind of roll off of her lips, darling. And it's a kind of provocative way of letting folks know she sees them, right? I want to start my presentation from there because often when Black women speak up against anything that we might deem as an injustice towards us, we get labeled as angry Black women. We get labeled as 5-letter words that start with the letter B. We get labeled as nagging. We get labeled as so many other things. And so I want to first center my portion of the presentation that the work that I will share from Black women who have done this theological journey does not come solely from a place of anger. They might be angry by some conditions they endured, but they are not angry Black women doing this work solely because they are angry, but rather they do this work like Nina Simone from a place of intelligence, from a place of interrogation, from a place of being clear about the hands they've been dealt, the work they are doing, and the work they believe can come forward based on what has come before them. Right. So I want to suggest to you tonight that Black women are not angry. We are attentive. And I know there are some women in the chat and in the space. And so I speak as myself, but I'm also speaking in a way that I think other Black women would say amen if it was Sunday morning and y'all were in Brooklyn with me at my church. So I want to start with the Black woman who really is responsible for this language we use called womanism. Okay, the woman who is responsible for this work is Alice Walker. Now, what's fascinating about Alice Walker, many of us know her from her seminal work, The Color Purple, which is obviously an award-winning novel turned play. It's still quite iconic. Alice Walker is one of the first individuals, if not the first person, to actually use the word womanist. Now, what's interesting about this is that Alice Walker is not someone who is a minister. She is not someone who is based in the church. She is not someone who is based in the theological academy. She is a novelist, and at times has even identified as agnostic. Yet her work is very critical for Black women theologians who begin to try to define themselves for themselves as we come out of the feminist movements of the 1970s. And so in her text, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Alice Walker first begins talking about this idea of what a womanist is. And she comes up with a 4-part definition of what womanists are. I only have 20 minutes. The definition takes about 15 minutes. I'm playing, but I'm not going to give you the 4-part definition. I encourage you to look it up. It is beautiful and profound. But you need to know that much of the womanist talk that is done in the Black church or is done in theological schools and divinity schools by Black professors finds its origin story in much of the literature and conversations that Alice Walker begins. Alice Walker says this: to be a womanist meant that one encompassed some facets of feminism, but with more inclusivity and appreciation for the Black experience. Whereas feminism offered a type of privilege to only white women, ignoring the many struggles of women of color, womanism confronted both sexism and racism. Later in the 1980s, we get the language from Kimberly Crenshaw called intersectionality. It is this idea that people have many dimensions of who they are and many identities. And because I am not just Black, but I am also a woman, I have certain things that I navigate as a Black woman that Black men do not navigate and that white women do not navigate. And so as a result, this conversation around womanism that Alice Walker presents is really a conversation that begins as she makes clear that, hey, wait a minute, there's a whole lot of liberation going on, but Black women are not being named, Black women are not being specified, and by nature of that, Black women are being left out. And to put this in the most layman term that I can think of, imagine your mother, your grandmother, your daughter, any woman in your family. And for the women on the call, imagine yourself, where you have extensively looked to support perhaps your husband, perhaps your uncle, perhaps your brother. You've made sure that they have what they need. Perhaps you have taken the time to make sure your children have everything that they need. And you probably find yourself wondering, is anybody taking space and time to make sure that I have what I need, right? In a sense, that is what's happening culturally on a much larger level, where Black women are locking arms for civil rights, locking arms for fair wages and maternity leave and all of those things that feminists were doing. And yet Black women were being left out of the conversation as things began to move forward across the nation. In the mid-1980s, we have some Black women theologians and seminarians who are students of James Cone. James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, who Quadri brilliantly discussed, is a professor at Union Seminary at this time. At the time of James Cone's death, he had taught at Union Seminary for 50 years. It is the first place he begins his teaching after receiving his PhD. It is the last place he teaches before he dies. And I need to just personally let you all know that Quadri and I had the honor of hosting Dr. Cone at one of his last talks on the campus of Yale Divinity School, where he spoke to us. He first spoke to our Black students. Quadri and I were the ones who interviewed him on Black theology and Black power. And then he then gave a public lecture. A mere 2 or 3 months later, he was deceased. And so we had the honor of sitting at his feet and hearing him discuss the importance of centering Black experience and centering Black liberation. But in the mid-1980s, Theologian and scholar Dr. Peter Paris puts it this way. In the mid-1980s, the Black liberation theologian Dr. James Cone was shocked when several African-American students at Union Theological Seminary in New York criticized Black theology's oversight of African-American women's experience in religion. That concern was heightened by their discernment that the nascent white feminist movement also rendered Black women invisible. So let me paint a picture for you. You've got white feminism, you got white women burning bras and you know, leaving Woodstock and sticking it to the man and doing all the things they're doing. You got Black liberation theologians like James Cone, who after King is killed, after Malcolm X is killed, after the civil rights movement has gone to a different place. Now we're in, as Quadri talked about, the era of Black power. We've got the Black Panthers. We've got folks who perhaps don't want to be nonviolent. You've got Cone working out what theology has to say, where many of those leaders who are getting the shine are Black men, even though you have your Fannie Lou Hamer, you have your Ella Baker, you have your Septima Clark, you have your Diane Nash, you have Black women who are leading, but they're not being centered. You have your Marian Wright Edelman, go on and on and on. But the names that we know are MLK, are Andrew Young, are John Lewis, are Stokely Carmichael. So you have this synergy of Black theology responding to the critical work of the Black Power movement, of the civil rights movement, and you have Black women looking at white women talking about women should have women's rights, but they're centering white experience. And then you got Alice Walker, who's working out and naming for herself, hey, y'all are not talking about me when you talk about women's rights, so I got issues with that. And even though she's not centering herself in theological discourse, she's centering herself in Black women's experience. And here are these three hungry seminarians sitting under the father of Black liberation theology about 20 years after his first seminal text, and they're saying, wait a minute, something is missing here. There's a text by Patricia Hill Collins, which is a brilliant text. Some of us are brave. All of the women are white. All of the men are Black. In essence, that is the frustration that leads these three seminarians to confront someone who at this point is pretty iconic. I need you the same way that you have SNCC and others confronting MLK at the height of his popularism, at the height of his iconic nature. You've got three Black women who are pulling the coattails of the men who everybody else is celebrating for bringing the discourse forward. This is dangerous work. This is brave work. And again, not work from a place of anger, though there might be anger, not doing it solely from a place of anger, but from a place of intelligence. I see that we are being left out, and it's not okay, even by someone who we value as much as Dr. James Cone. So we get to this conversation around womanism. And to be womanist meant that one encompassed some facets of feminism, right? That some facets of women should be, women should have equal rights. Women should be able to earn, a living based on their skill sets. Women should be able to have what they need. They should be able to do everything they need to do, right? So it's this facets of feminism, but with more inclusivity and appreciation for Black experience, which is the work that Alice Walker is up to as she begins to work out womanism and work out different novels. And then later on comes Toni Morrison, and later on comes all these other literary scholars who are dealing with what Black women are due. Whereas feminism offered a type of privilege to only white women, ignoring the many struggles of women of color, womanism looked to confront both sexism and racism. Later, we get the terminology from Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality, the tri-dimensional reality of race, class, and gender is how we talk about it in womanism. And in 1985, after merely being relegated to a written word, defined and shelved in 4 parts as a self-avowed naming of one woman novelist, Alice Walker, right? So womanism is a term that's unpacked, but kind of shelved after people see the novelty of it. It's kind of shelved, and people go back to the word feminism because it's just more dominant. After we get all that in search of our mother's gardens, the word womanist gives rise to a movement and this is where we get to the Black church, gives rise to a movement that was first embodied in the minds and faith commitments of 3 Black female seminarians and graduate students at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York: Katie Cannon, Dolores Williams, Jacqueline Grant. I only have 20 minutes, but I want you to know, if you want to know anything about womanism and how it originated, how it began, learn these 3 names: Katie Cannon, Dolores Williams, and Jacqueline Grant. They are the students of James Cone, who said, hey, Dr. Cone, we respect you, but you forgot about us. You're missing something here. They're those students in class who challenge the professor. They're those students in class who the professors both hate and love at the same time. And so if you want to know about that, you need to know those 3 words. Womanist approaches to the study of religion and theology then began to spread like wildfire through the American Academy of Religion, the Society of Biblical Literature. Here's what y'all need to know. I don't know what professions are represented here, but every profession has a credentialing conference, right? If you are an MBA, if you are a lawyer, you might have been a part of BALSA. You might have been a part of the National MBA Association. You might have been a part of NSBE if you're an engineer. Whatever your field, there's a gathering place where professionals who know the work gather and credential, right? Well, for us as theologians, AAR, American Academy of Religion, and the Society of Biblical Literature, it does not get any bigger than that for us. And that's not just Black folks. That's just people who want to do theology and religion professionally. Anybody who works at any of these universities that you respect has to go through this kind of vetting, regardless of the degree. You also have to write, you also have to present, you also have to defend. Your scholarship gets vetted, peer reviewed through these types of entities, right? These 3 brilliant, brave women, young women, bring their critiques of Cone not only to the classroom, but they bring it to the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature. This is how womanism begins to spread as quickly as it does, because they basically brought it to everybody who can say, y'all are wild and we're not doing this. They take a risk. The risk pans out. It is said that Katie Cannon was so nervous that she fainted at the podium when she was getting ready to give her presentation of theological womanism. And then she gets up and goes on to present. So these are the faces of these 3 brilliant Black women. This is them later in life. I need you to understand they were young. They were young women. There are not very many pictures of them when they were young, but they were doing this work when they had to be late 20s, early 30s young, and then continue to push the discipline forward for the next 30 or so years of their lives. Katie Cannon passed away in 2017. The others are still with us. They're still alive. Let's jump to the 2000s. I got a little bit of time. I think I have about 3 more minutes. I'm going to use them for modern day engagement of this feminism versus womanism kind of conversation. And then I believe we're moving to questions. Let's jump out of the 1980s. Let's jump into 2013, 2014, 2017. Feminist, this word right here in the middle. The black on pink is the color scheme that Beyonce used for her surprise self-titled album in 2017. A whole new, sorry, not 2017, excuse me, 2014. A whole new generation was introduced to the word feminist by a Black woman, Beyonce, through her song Flawless. When you listen to the song Flawless, I Woke Up Like This, Beyonce has an audio recording of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's text, "We should all be feminists." Literally in the middle of the song, at the height of the song, before she says, "You wake up flawless," all that, she has this woman define feminist. It cannot be lost on us how significant that cultural moment is, because this book had also just come out in 2014 after a very viral TED Talk had gone the year before of this same text. This book is basically a TED Talk put to paper. Beyonce gets word of it. Beyonce already, y'all know, Beyonce loves Black women. I could say more because I'm part of the Beehive, but I won't because I don't, time is coming. But Beyonce loves Black women, okay? Period, stop, don't come for me. I said what I said. Beyonce loves Black women. And Beyonce went and found an African Black woman, a woman who lives on the continent when she wrote this and still lives on the continent, and had this woman explain what this idea of feminism was. It broke open a large and necessary conversation. You then fast forward to 2017, you have the first ever International Women's Day with a cohort of women of varying ethnicities claiming to be feminist. It got so big that they are literally on the cover of Vogue by January 2017. Even in the midst of this Women's March, we get the same critique that happens back in the 80s of Cone, that Alice Walker has of the feminist movement in the 70s, that Black women have in 2017 against these leaders. Where is the presence of the Black woman? Where is the experience of the Black woman? But when Beyonce brings Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie into the conversation, it's two Black women having a conversation. As a result, I would argue that there are more folks in 2022, Black women, who would identify as being a Black feminist than being a Black womanist. Because even though we get the language womanism from Alice Walker, who is not in the Theological Academy, it is mostly individuals who are in the Theological Academy, basically people who teach theology, teach preaching, teach in divinity schools and seminaries, who own that word womanism. Feminism, though it has some white-centered concerns, it still is the more dominant word. And then when Beyonce puts it in her song in 2014, it becomes another dominant term for a larger audience. People will often say, well, what's the difference between Black feminism, Black womanism? What's the difference? What's the difference? We don't have time to get into that right now. But what I will say to you is this. These terms got popularized in the past few years again for another generation. And the conversation and the dialogue is still going. Here's where I'm going to end. Black churches are made up of 70% of Black women. I believe that we must begin to tell clearer stories about Black women. They may not be students, but I'm sure there are people in your atmosphere, in your environment that may come to you like they came to Cone and say, hey, I respect a lot of what you do, but I don't hear my experience. And people are hungry for their experience. And one of the ways that we can be intentional about telling the experiences of Black women, of looking out for the experiences of Black women, is to use what womanists call a hermeneutic of suspicion. What it means is when you read the Bible, like Samuel was just talking about, you read the Bible with question marks. What would the woman say? Where is the woman's experience? What is being hidden? What is being covered? And then when you do that, you then engage in the work of what critical race theory calls counter storytelling, where you then begin to re-narrate, wait a minute, we left something out. Wait a minute, this is not complete. Wait a minute, there's something that we have missed. Counter storytelling is a method of telling stories of people whose experiences are not told. And too often in the Black church, even though Black women make up 70%, even though Black women were students of James Cone, even though Black women are now Vice President of the United States and a sitting Supreme Court judge, there are still countless experiences of Black women being present, but their stories not being told. They're present, but silent, or silenced, I should say. Counter storytelling is the work of resisting erasure, gives power to the voices of individuals and communities. Everybody can participate in counter storytelling. Every day you ought to commit to telling the story of a Black woman somewhere where it's not already being lifted up. And so lastly, I think I'm at my time if I'm not over. Tell Black women stories, my last slide. I am less interested in whether you choose the term feminist or womanist. I wanted to give you some of the history so you know who uses what, but I do believe we must begin to center the lives and liberation of Black women in our churches. I believe we owe Black women that. With that, I yield my time back.
All right, thank you, Reverend Wilkes, for that. Very enlightening, very uplifting, and I'm going to turn it over to the chat to Brother Ruel Dixon, but Reverend Wilkes, I put in the chat, and I was wondering if you were familiar with the great Ruby Sales. I've come to know, and she spoke and she spoke exactly about that in civil rights, what she calls the Southern Freedom Movement. That she said Black women were at the forefront of organizing and leading. He said, but it was Black men who grabbed the mic and essentially the attention. But she said it was Black women who were leading those efforts. And so I was very happy to hear you bring that forward, of those stories that need to be told. So thank you for that. And I listen to her faithfully every day. Ruby Sales every day.
Yeah, she's wonderful. Yeah, she's based right here in New
Absolutely.
York.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. So Brother Rusty, I'll turn over to you.
All right. The first question that we have is for Quadri. How were you first introduced to Dr. Cohn's work, and how has it impacted your work?
Yeah, so the first introduction was I studied like philosophy and religion when I was in undergrad and didn't have a single Black professor in my department, right? So it was kind of like like dealing with some of the topics that I was dealing with. I think, and this speaks to I know the second question as well, maybe I'm jumping the gun about like Cohn's legacy. He got so big to a point in the American Religious Academy. It's like you can't like responsibly be a religious scholar and not be like not know who he is on some level. Like yeah, he's that big of a deal, right? But no, I didn't really have it because again, not having any Black professors, right? Didn't really have a chance to dive into his work thoroughly until I got to Yale Divinity School and working with people like Dr. Ebony Marshall Terman and Dr. Kerry Day, right? And yeah, it's really a shame that you had to get to that level of education before we start centralizing Black voices in an intellectual level, right? At the master's level, it's really wild that I had to wait that long to like really get them.
Okay, thank you for that, Brother Harris. Brother Ross Lee, the Black practice of Christianity, is it presented as a philosophy of living and or how to live as opposed to the white practice of Christianity?
Is it presented as a philosophy of living as opposed to the white philosophy of Christianity?
Philosophy of living and or how to live as opposed to the white practice of Christianity?
No, sadly, and this is the point that Cohn, the womanist theologians, feminist theologians, and Wimbush are making. Wimbush makes this from the standpoint of the Bible, because even with all of the philosophical stuff that we get from theologians, we always return to the Bible. My pastor used to say the Bible is the book of the illiterate. So even illiterate people know about the Bible, right? Even though they may not be able to necessarily read, and not just people in the church, but people outside the church. And because we get our interpretation of that primarily from a white hermeneutical structure, a white method of interpretation, that becomes the guide by which we do things, in which we engage certain things. I don't want to. You talk about the civil rights movement and the women who, put together the pamphlets, did the mimeographs and that kind of stuff, and put out the things about the bus boycott. They too, like we are stuck in white theological perspectives and prisms and prisons. They too were stuck in a sexist and patriarchal prism of the church and of the Black church, which tends to be very conservative and very patriarchal itself. So it wasn't just that. I would disagree a little bit that the Black the men grabbed the mic. They were given the mic because that was the way it was. We thought it was supposed to be. And so we take in verses like women be silent in the church. Ask your husbands at home and that kind of stuff. If we don't challenge those kinds of scriptures from a historical perspective, from a cultural perspective, then we continue to imbibe them and we continue to live and act in those ways within our churches, so that the white confessional dominancy doesn't have to actually be in the church, because they're Black agents in the Black church that are presenting and pressing the white theological perspective and the white theological hermeneutic, biblical hermeneutic. So sadly, the answer to that question is yes, for many of us. Of course, there are, different, there are those that are not like that way. And that's why, Jeremiah Wright got into so much quote unquote trouble with John Lewis, who called good trouble, because he was obviously not doing that. And there are other churches that don't do that as well, other pastors that don't do that as well. There's a pastor at Emmanuel Baptist Church who doesn't do that, but there are others who, obviously do.
Okay, thank you for that. And Ms. Wilkes, I know you're talking about feminism and womanism, and you say that's a very big topic. But in the next minute or two, can you differentiate between feminism and womanism for us?
I can't. I'm so sorry. I gave you what I could, but I can't do that in a minute.
Okay. All right. Brother Walton, we don't have any more questions in the chat, so I'll turn it back over to you.
So since we don't have any more questions, maybe we can give Reverend Wilkes the time she needs to answer that question.
Sure. So I think that feminism and womanism both aspire to ensure that women's experiences are centered. Womanism, however, is particularly concerned about the experience of Black women. So one of my professors at Yale Divinity School would say that Black women are womanists, that Black men can study womanism, but they cannot be womanists because Black women are womanists. Now, the title of Chimanga's text is We Should All Be Feminists. There's an idea that everyone can be feminist because everyone can believe in the equality of the sexes, but that womanism, as one of my professors would say, is confessional, right? So we don't trust folks who claim they are quote unquote womanist until they confess that they are. And so that gets into the internalized patriarchy that Samuel Ross Lee was just referring to, which is many Black women have been taught so many patriarchal ways of being that unless Black women confess that they are womanists and explain what that means, we don't trust them either, because you have to be taught how to unlearn what has been given to us for generations about Black women's place. And I'll give you a prime example. Before we got on this conversation, I asked the men, I said, you all can either call me Gabby or you can call me Reverend, but I don't answer to sister, because sister has been terminology that has been used for generations to lessen Black women's scholarship who are also ministers, right? So there are very many individuals who would call me doctor before they would ever call me reverend, because they assume that I can learn about and teach about theology. But preaching theology is a completely different thing. There are Black men who would not do that, and there are Black women who would not do that. And so there's a lot more that I can say, but what I will end this on is Alice Walker coins the term womanism for Black women at a critical time where Black women are not being heard or seen in the Black liberation movements, nor in the feminist movements. And she intentionally creates almost a world within a world for Black women. And the Black women who later challenge Cone and later create a discipline, which is a very young discipline as relative as disciplines go, in the 80s, they basically say this work also needs to be done with our text, with how we interpret scripture, and with what we teach men and women about Black women. Last thing I'll say is this: James Cone names that the reason why he writes Black Theology and Black Power is out of guilt. He writes this book in 1969 because while civil rights activists are being gunned down in the streets, while civil rights folks are marching and protesting and getting locked up and getting dog sicked on them and everything else, Cone is in what he would call the white I'm blanking on the terminology, but basically Cone is in the halls of white theology studying white theologians. It ain't that Quadri just didn't have any white professors in 2013 or whenever he was at Pace. Cone is studying solely white folks, white theology, all white everything. Cone becomes radicalized out of guilt and out of what is my place as a trained Black theologian and preacher and AME minister, African Methodist Episcopal denomination, which is founded by Richard Allen, who walks out of a white church because they wouldn't let Black folks pray. That's how Black Cone is in his formation. And yet he is solely centering and learning white theologians. And that's the only way he gets hired at Union. He would not have got hired at Union if he was studying Black theologians. He had to prove that he could speak the language of white folks. And he says that he wrote this book out of guilt for feeling like he did not have a place in the movement at that time. And out of his writing births an entire discipline of how we can use both the theological academy and the pulpit to push back against whiteness and to reclaim God as Black. And to reclaim the fact that Black people are not just living a white man's religion, but that from the continent, we came with our own faith, and people have not been correctly interpreting who we are and what our faith is. In the same way, when Black women do womanism, we do it out of a commitment to say, I can't be silent about Black women not being handled appropriately in the church or the theological academy. This is my commitment to what the history books will say about how Black folks showed up for Black women. It is not just to say her name. It is not just in the hashtag Me Too, but it is also in how Black women push against everybody who wants to silence us in the pulpit, who wants to silence us in the classroom. Womanism does that. Feminism can, but womanism exists to do that. Feminism may do it. Womanism is not womanism if it doesn't do it. In the same way that Black theology is not Black theology if it does not center Black lived experience, Black lives, and Black liberation.
Well, I'm glad you took the time to answer that, because that is powerful, and I think I can hear you speak about that all day. But I did have a question for you, and I hope I get it right, because I think you said that men think you can learn theology. Did you say theology?
Teach.
You can learn to teach it, but not preach it. So are you talking specifically to Black men or men in the church, within the church, or in general?
Your pick. You give me who you want to give me, and that's fine. What I'm saying is there is the reason why I'm clear about the language that I prefer when I'm referred to is because there is a history of systemic oppression against Black women and what we are allowed to do. And so by the very nature of certain titles, we proclaim what we expect. So you can say Black men, all men, it doesn't matter. But what I'm saying is that there's a history attached to the titles that are used. And my example was, it's not just about giving respect, because folks who don't believe Black women can preach, if they have an earned doctorate, they'll call them doctor, because that doesn't have to necessarily equate to church leadership, though it may equate to leadership in a particular field or discipline, which typically most men don't have a problem with.
So and you mentioned leadership, so it kind of goes back to overall the issue of Black women as leaders and questioning their leadership. So not just in your field, but in general.
Well, I would push back a little bit. So this is what I will say. I will say yes in general, which is why I started with Alice Walker, and Alice Walker has to stay in the conversation, because Alice Walker's not thinking about the church, period. Wasn't then, wasn't now. She's thinking about Black women, period. All right, the cultural experience of Black women. So that's what makes womanism universal. But I have to say because this conversation centers Black theology in the Black church, there's different work that has to be done in the Black church, because you could take the same individual, male or female, non-binary, whatever you want to call it, who has made peace with Black women's leadership in other spaces, who has not made the same peace with
Yes.
Black women's leadership
Yes.
in the church.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And I think
Right.
if I could just jump in really quickly there, that has all to do with our theology, right? And how we frankly start teaching children how to think about and how to talk about God. And a lot of times, yeah, there is that understanding that and this gets into the hermeneutic of suspicion, because a lot of times it is very biblical. It's right, like God cannot be female, like God cannot be woman. God, it's unholy for God to descend upon or even touch women in certain, scriptural contexts and things like that, right? And it's like we drill those things into children, and things like, new members orientation and vacation Bible school and Bible and whatever the case may be, right? So it's like, yeah, we really gotta be intelligent about how we utilize those things.
Yeah, and if I could add to this, because I think this is significantly important. The thing that drives our belief system primarily is the Bible. We have verses in the Bible that subjugate women. And those are the things that are used to say women can't do this in the church. Women be silent in the church. And the office of a bishop, must be the husband of one wife, and all this kind of stuff. The deacon, speak about in male terms in most places, unless we talk about Priscilla and Aquila, right? Where the English translation takes the same word, deacon, diakonos, and translates it into something else other than deacon. So it is very important that we look at these things as it relates to the Bible, because that is the ruling document of the church. The theological perspectives and the theological things that Cone brings to us, and the womanist theologians bring to us, and the feminist theologians bring to us, are engaged in the seminaries. But it's in the church where they will take the Bible and they will say, this is what God said. And they use that to maintain a certain kind of status quo that is predominated by a translation and an interpretation that we get from the Western world. That is not how we began to engage the Bible. That's what we embraced from other people, and then we brought it into our situation. She talks about Richard Allen leaving the white church because they couldn't, come to the altar and pray. The mistake, however, along the lines is that when they left the white church, they left it because of the social reality, what they could not do, what they had to sit in the balcony. They couldn't come down to the altar to pray. But they took with them the biblical interpretation, the confessional ideas. They took all of that stuff with them, and in doing so, they infested the Black church with the same sin, I dare say, the same patriarchy, the same non-liberative ideas into the into the Black church. They took it from the white church and took it into the Black church. And that's why we are doing what we're doing in a way that is not helpful to us. And until we have a different way and a better way of engaging the Bible, we're going to continue to do that. Because every time you start saying, this is not right, this shouldn't be, somebody's going to go to a Bible verse. And they're gonna proclaim that God said this, and therefore this is how it should be done, as opposed to understand that this is a historical document written by men, has a certain context in space and time, and that space and time dictates what's in there. It's not something that fell out of heaven with the words of Christ written in red. It came from human beings. It's not the word of God more so than it is the words about God, written by human beings. And when we look at it and understand it that way, then we can understand that this can be critiqued. This can be challenged, even though it's in the Bible. it not only can it be, but it must be based on the perspective that we give it and the place that we give it in our lives. It must be critiqued. It can't not just be accepted, and the interpretation of it cannot just be accepted that comes from somebody who is not even on the same trajectory towards liberation that we are on as Black people.
Yeah. So listen, I feel it's starting to get a little warm in here. We imagine we can go on all night, but out of respect to our audience and respect to our panelists, we're going to start to wrap up. So I would dare say we'll give our panelists in the order in which they came on. We'll give them 30 seconds to give us their last thoughts, and we'll start with Minister Harris.
Brother Walton, I know Miss Wilkes, Reverend Wilkes, is strapped for time, so can we allow her to go first, because I think she has to jump off.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm elated to have been with you all, and I pray that this information has piqued your interest. And Google away, my friends, Google away. There's much to find, and there's a wonderful journey to enjoy. Blessings to you.
All right. Thank you for being with us, Reverend Wilkes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, Brother Harris, Minister Harris.
Yeah, to echo the same sentiments, it was absolutely a privilege and an honor to be with you on this evening to talk about Black theology from a Christian perspective. Please, please, please continue to read up on figures like not only just Dr. James Cone, but Dolores Williams, Katie Cannon, Jacqueline Grant, like these great pivotal figures that are towering Black intellectuals and some of the most faithful Christians of the 20th and 21st century, right? And we have access to them, and they're often underutilized in Black spaces. Like, seriously, like most people reading these authors and these books are fellow white academics. So we just encourage us to utilize these resources that our ancestors have left for us to help us get free. God bless.
Okay, thank you, Minister Harris, and thanks for being with us. And you did all right for being. Never mind. And we'll end with brother Sam Ross Lee.
I want to thank the brothers of my chapter, Epsilon, Iota chapter, for engaging this topic and allowing me to bring it forth, and thank the panelists for agreeing to be here. When we talk about the Bible, it is often very difficult for people to do so. It is a book that we have been told what it is before we even open it up. And so we have a certain kind of perspective about it before we even read it. That is dangerous, and we need a re-engagement. The late, great Dr. James Cone opened up an avenue for us to critique Western white theological perspectives. If he had not done that, I do not think that Vincent Wimbush and others would have even engaged that perspective from the biblical perspective. But it's a very necessary and important perspective, because, as I said, when I go to the pulpit on Sunday morning, I do not open up the Cone. I do him in Bible study. I have taught from that book in Bible class, Black Theology and Black Power. Matter of fact, Minister Harris has been in one of the classes. But when we go to the pulpit on Sunday morning, we open up the Bible. When we go to Sunday school, we open up the Bible. When we go to Bible class, we open the Bible. So it's very important how we understand the Bible, and how we use the Bible, how we interpret the Bible, how we apply the Bible, how we critique the Bible, so that it does not become a tool of oppression, which it has been in the past, and to some degree, in a large degree, still is now, but becomes a tool of liberation for our churches, for our community, and for our people. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This has been wonderful. It's been powerful. And it's definitely been thought-provoking. So I do encourage folks. I know I'm going to kind of look up some of these individuals and re-examine my relationship with religion and the Bible. And so thank you very much for that. So listen, to our audience, thank you for being here. Thank you for staying with us for overtime. Before you sign off, I just want to say, please make plans to be with us on Wednesday, May 25th for our next Uplift series. It's going to be around the business of cannabis. You don't want to miss that. There are opportunities for the next growth, financial growth industry for us, and we're going to have some panelists who are going to show us exactly how to do that. So please plan to be with us on May 25th. And in customary, I just want to thank the Social Action Committee for all of their work, starting with our esteemed boss list, Brother Alexander Jones, and our vice boss list, Brother soon to be Dr. Ruel Dixon. And then, of course, Brother Martindale, Brother Streeter, Brother Spearman, Brother Charles, Brother Jones, Brother Reed, Brother Rossley, Brother Cockrell, and Brother Johnson. And again, to our audience, thank you for being with us. And please, next time, spread the word, bring a friend, because we're going to have the last two are going to be, it's going to be hard to top this one, but we're going to have some very powerful conversations in May and June. So thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month.
Are we saying on?